Hello, I'm Kristin Kelterborn, and I am a Senior Project Manager at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. Today I'll be interviewing Johanna Mendelson Forman. Johanna has become one of the leading voices in the emerging movement of social gastronomy. Her frontline experience as a policymaker on conflict and stabilization efforts drove her interest in connecting the role of food in conflict, resulting in the creation of Conflict Cuisine, an introduction to war and peace around the dinner table, an interdisciplinary course she teaches at American University in Washington, D.C. Johanna is also a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, where she heads the food security program. Johanna, it is a pleasure to have you here at WDI and have this opportunity to interview you.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Our interview will focus on the use of food to promote cross-cultural understanding and the players in the social gastronomy movement, including the private sector. To kick off the conversation, let's start off with defining some terms. What are the meanings of social gastronomy, gastrodiplomacy, and culinary diplomacy, and the differences between them?
Wow, it's a good question, and I knew you'd start with social gastronomy. Social gastronomy is really a movement that has started around chefs who are trying to do good with food. So I would say it's chefs for the common good. They see their use of food not only as a way to feed people, but a way to do other things, such as protecting the environment, reducing food waste. They see their role as feeding the hungry, of teaching people about nutrition. And they mostly want to see their role as training other people so that they have livelihoods through the use of food. Now, so gastrodiplomacy and culinary diplomacy are two parts of a bigger use of food as soft power. So culinary diplomacy is what government to governments do, what states do to each other in terms of using food as a tool of persuasion. Instead of using guns, they use butter. In the terms of gastrodiplomacy, I would say that's people-to-people diplomacy. So when you go to a food truck in downtown Detroit, that's an experience where you're using your palate to sample the cuisines of another country and hopefully gaining a better understanding about food through that cultural environment.
Thank you, Johanna. So of those three different areas, which one do you focus your work on, or does it cut across the three areas?
Well, I think social gastronomy uses both culinary diplomacy and gastrodiplomacy. People who practice social gastronomy, and I would say again it's a relatively new movement, are often people in the food sector who want to use their food for doing good. So anything that you see from people who are helping feed the homeless to food and soup kitchens are all part of that movement, but also we see lots of training programs, training youth in how to use food as a way to create a job. There's a lot of that work going on, and it's global. There's work going on in Latin America, in Europe, and it's now had a big impact also as we see people moving more and more around the world, because food is a good way to get a job that pays a wage. It's not the informal sector, and that's something that makes a difference when you're searching for something to do and you don't speak a language.
So how did you become interested in social gastronomy, and how did your course, Conflict Cuisine, come about?
Well, that's a long story, but I don't know if we have the time to go through all of it. But I had been working for many years on post-conflict reconstruction, what some call nation building, of how countries recover from war. And after doing that for almost 20 years, I was very frustrated by discovering that many countries fell back into war. But the one thing that I thought was a good tool that existed is that food was always a constant. It was a lens by which one could look at conflict, because food could be a symbol of somebody's way of dealing with conflict, but also when many people escaped from war, often all they had was their recipes and a taste of their homeland when they recreated them. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun if I told students that you could learn about war and peace and still taste the foods of these countries? And because I live in Washington, D.C., it's pretty well known that we could always have a saying there that you could always tell where America was at war by what restaurants opened up. Mm-hmm. And while that was true until 2001, we certainly had diaspora from many wars, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Ethiopia to the Persians who came from Iran during the late 70s, to the Central Americans who inhabit our city. Washington, D.C. is the second largest city after Addis Ababa in terms of the number of Ethiopians who live there. So we had a laboratory to test this theory, and I was just fortunate enough that the university I was at was willing to take the chance and try a course that involved both eating out as well as doing good and learning about conflict.
Who are the key players in the social gastronomy movement, and in particular, what is the role of entrepreneurs?
Well, that's another important issue to discuss because, as I say, while social gastronomy is new in terms of people who are practicing it, the Sustainable Development Goals, which followed the Millennium Development Goals, have a goal to end hunger worldwide. That's Sustainable Development Goal number 2. A group of advocates, many of whom included chefs, but also people who worked in the hunger prevention business, decided that they could create a movement around social gastronomy by engaging chefs to become advocates and activists. In fact, there's a new book that just came out called Feed the Resistance, written by a chef, which includes recipes to make quickly when you're trying to be activists. But this Social Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub, which was created last year, is serving as a base for a network of chefs. There are 138 right now who are members, but they're in 38 countries, which is also interesting, and they're bringing in more and more people each day. And the countries that they come from vary from Brazil to Peru to Venezuela, in Latin America to European countries, for example, where there are large refugee migrations, to the United Kingdom, to countries in Asia, which are starting to get involved. And it's growing because people who cook, who always like to entertain and help people, also feel that they can be doing good with the skills that they have. So taking technical skills and putting them to practice is important.
Can you think of an example of an entrepreneur who is running a business and at the same time practicing some of these components of gastrodiplomacy or social gastronomy?
Well, the most famous one these days in the United States is Jose Andres, the Spanish-born chef who has the Think Food Group, but also has the World Central Kitchen. So by day, he has a successful business with restaurants, but he also has this social development movement through his non-governmental organization called the World Central Kitchen, which was working to train chefs in Haiti and Nicaragua, and then during the terrible hurricane in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria, went off and used a network of chefs to try and feed people who weren't being reached by humanitarian aid that was being distributed by the government. So that's a very notable example. But in other countries, there are people who are doing this kind of work as well. For example, in Peru, you have Gaston Acudia, who is a very well-known Peruvian chef who brought his European training back to Peru and started using indigenous food. What he did was he created a movement of indigenous growers who were growing organic foods that hadn't been used in restaurants before, because the indigenous cuisine of Peru, the quinoa, the potatoes, of which there are 500 or more varieties, the kinds of different beans and grains that were natural to the environment were being integrated. So he created a market which bolstered the business of these small growers and created livelihood for them where before their foods were being discarded. And then another entrepreneur, in another case, which in some ways is sad, is in Venezuela. Some of the high-end restaurants, which still exist in spite of the food shortages, get together in a team and create food products for hospitals and for schools where there is insufficient food. And there's a chef there named Carlos Garcia who owns the most #1 restaurant in the city. It's on the best restaurants in the Americas, who does this every single day. And he feeds hundreds and hundreds of children a week, cancer patients and then children in school. And then we have this project that we're working on in Turkey, and you've been involved in that as well. Turkey is a country which has received over 3.5 million Syrians from the war in Syria, and that's a neighboring state to Turkey. Their food entrepreneurship is growing by creating food incubators modeled on some that we have in the United States, where we're allowing people who have an interest in entrepreneurship and an interest in cooking to come together get their skills improved, and create a livelihood in a country where they're probably going to be staying for many, many years while the conflict goes on there.
This year it was announced that Cargill would spend $1.5 million to promote social gastronomy. What are your observations of how corporations are engaging with social gastronomy, and what do you think their motivations are for doing so?
Well, I think social gastronomy, because it's doing good through the use of food, is a natural area that a corporation should become engaged with. Cargill became interested in this group in Brazil called Gastro because its chef, David Hertz, who's very charismatic, had come to the conclusion that he needed to do something in his own country to take youth who were working in these very poor neighborhoods, in the slums, and take them out of there. And one path out of these slums, instead of being in gangs, was to teach them how to cook. He now has schools in Rio de Janeiro, and he has schools in Sao Paulo, but he's also expanded the network, and I think Cargill is trying to do two things with its funding. One is to help sustain these schools and bring more people in and have them duplicated, but also they too are involved in this network I discussed as well of chef advocates who are going to be engaged globally in this type of effort.
Have you seen other private sector companies or corporations becoming involved in social gastronomy, or has it been pretty much Cargill?
No, I think there are other companies. In the United Kingdom, for example, where the hub is located, I know that Tesco, which is a big company, it's similar to our, I guess, Costco, is doing this kind of work. And chefs themselves who have businesses like Gordon Ramsay is his name, I'm pretty sure, are doing this kind of work in their own schools. The other part of social gastronomy is that people are hiring young people who are trained and creating a chain of employment. But they're also creating products from this. I just saw a company in the United Kingdom calls Rubies into Rubble, or Rubble into Rubies. And they're making jams and preserves, and this is a group of women who were refugees who are now producing this and selling it at the Covent Garden Market. There are projects that are involved with refugee chefs. In France, for the last 2 years, 2 French businessmen decided to support refugee food fairs around the country, and now they're moving into other cities in Europe. In Germany, in Berlin, which has a large number of refugees, there is an urban souk, an urban market, where products from the Middle East are being sold so that refugees have a good supply chain of products that they're familiar with. So social gastronomy manifests itself in many ways.
Mm-hmm. And so the people who are buying the products, they are learning about the culture of the producers. So for example, they're learning about the history of the refugees who...
Right, I think it has a benefit for both sides, because the businesses see a market in the newly arrived people, and they also see products they might develop as a result of having newcomers. And on the other hand, it creates an opportunity for them to import things from countries where they may not have opportunities before. So I think it's a good exchange. How long it will last is not clear, but I don't see the downside at this point.
Okay, and do you see the social gastronomy movement growing over the next 5 years, let's say? Is there a lot of momentum behind it?
I think right now there's a tremendous interest, particularly among younger chefs, who, in addition to wanting to do good, also see their role as a sustaining of the planet role. That if they're going to be people who prepare food, they want to be people who prepare food in an ethical way. They want animals killed and sacrificed in a way which is humane. They don't want food waste, because food waste is not only a tragedy for people who can't have enough to eat, but it's a bad thing for the environment. So you have chefs who want to become educators, chefs who go into schools and teach people about how to eat nutritious meals. And I think it's a benefit in 2 ways, in that they start connecting to the community, which of course is the basis for change, and at the same time they are using their skills that they have in a constructive way, in addition to making expensive meals for the public.
So to end the interview, Johanna, I have one last question, and that is, you also state in your course syllabus that oftentimes the only engagement we have with immigrant populations is at restaurants, tasting food either familiar or foreign to us. how can we use that entry point, the dinner table, to look beyond the cuisine to what drove a particular group to their new home? How would you answer that question?
Well, I think sociologists have talked about ethnic restaurants as the living room of the homesick. And the reason is that when you've lost your place in the world, when you can't go home again, often the only thing that you have to connect you is your cuisine. What I think is interesting, though, is that in our own country, in the United States, ethnic restaurants are no longer something where only people from a specific ethnicity go to, but people from the community go to as well. They go there because they like the taste of the food, and I think that's an important way to be introduced to a new group of people. If you have a positive feeling about what you've eaten, you probably will most likely have a more positive feeling about the country. So for example, in the 50s and 60s, Chinese food became very popular in many major urban areas outside of the West Coast. And Americans started eating Chinese food. When it came time for Nixon to open up China, and there was a survey done, Americans were less afraid of dealing with the Chinese because they were familiar with the Chinese, and the survey said, how are you familiar with them? And it was through Chinese restaurants. So food can create a positive image or a negative image about a culture. And I always wonder if we had had more Russian restaurants, whether we would have been able to have ended the Cold War earlier, because people do develop feelings about countries through their taste buds.
Well, thank you so much, Johanna, for sharing about your exciting work in social gastronomy. I appreciate you being with us today.
And thank you, Kristin. I'm very happy to be here, even if it's cold.